Welcome everyone to this LRS webinar, the first in a series. Why are we here today? Well, as the Labour Research Service, we are hoping to stimulate your thinking, to bring things that you need, and to interest you in attending the next in the series. This particular webinar is an introduction to what we're calling the Negotiator's Guide. And we're going to go through the chapters that make up the Negotiator's Guide. As the name implies, it is meant for anybody within and without unions interested in representing workers. We're going to introduce just a few leading ideas from each of those chapters. The subsequent webinars, we will deep dive into each of these chapters one by one. But to begin, we're going to provide some kind of bargaining update, a sort of high-level bargaining update. We're then going to hear from comrades who are going to bring us updates from collective bargaining where they're located, and I will introduce them later on. We will be playing a pre-recording of their inputs. And then, having done that little update, we will then move to the introduction of the guide. And that is the program today. And so we begin as we sit here to talk about negotiating. Let's talk about quickly what's happening out there. We're going to look at three factors. We're going to get an update on the national minimum wage. We're going to consider some economic indicators, and we're going to consider some collective bargaining indicators. Most of you should be aware when talking about the national minimum wage that as of 2022, the Commission has equalized all other minimums in South Africa, apart from the minimum rates for the expanded public works program. All on now, we may finally talk of a single national minimum wage, since the wages of domestic workers and farm workers were equalized. That level now sits at 23 Rand and 19 cents per hour, or 12 Rand 75 for the EPWP. And this amounts to about 4,000 Rand a month for a 40-hour week. And in the case of the EPWP, shade over 2,200 a month. The national minimum wage, the main rate, has increased by 16% since its inception in January 2019. All right, let us consider a handful of economic indicators to understand where we're located when we consider bargaining in the South African economy. This first slide is just to provide some perspective and to put current GDP in perspective. This is a history of GDP growth for all the way back from 94 to the current day. Those of you who remember the so-called financial crisis of 2009, you can see that it is a dip, but compared to the more recent crash around COVID, it's really, really small. And I think this just serves to put what's happened in the last couple of years in perspective. This was an apocalyptic crash of the economy. So if it feels like a special situation, it should, because it really is. The main graph you're looking at here looks at GDP from Q1 2020, the first quarter of 2020, which is really important because that is our last pre-pandemic quarter. And then it looks at the change to quarter 3 of 2021, so late last year. By sector, what you will see is that it is only agriculture and personal services that have recovered to above pre-COVID levels. Mining, business services, government services, close. And then a range of sectors still haven't recovered to those levels, and construction performing especially badly. In the top right-hand corner, I've just posted a little update. Stats SA just released GDP numbers. These are annualized changes to Q2. So in other words, over the last year, so Q1 2021 to Q1 2022. It's just useful to understand these are the contributions to GDP, what the sector, so manufacturing making a strong contribution, which is good to see. Mining and construction still not doing very well. A quick look at mining numbers. This graph is a little complicated, but let me walk you through it very quickly. We're looking at four commodity groups: coal, gold, iron ore, and platinum group metals. And then for each one, I've banded coal. There's two readings on it. The first is volume, and the second is value. I've put some little line here to show you the trend line, and it tracks it from early 2020 to the end of last year. And what we find for each of the commodity groups is that production is generally down for coal, gold, slightly up for iron ore, volume also up for PGMs. But in all cases, the value of that production is up. And this is, of course, driven by higher commodity prices. So even where production is down, the sales value is up on previous levels because of higher prices. So a mixed reading from mining. Manufacturing, very important part of our economy, a relatively mixed bag, but I think what it tells you is that for the most part, we've seen slight increases from Q1 2021. The notable exception is transport equipment, which is quite sharply down on the past, and the others are relatively flat. A quick look at trade, imports and exports. I put a red line here to show you where the pandemic hits, and you see trade in terms of imports and exports falls off the cliff when the pandemic lands. Has since recovered quite strongly to well, certainly in the case of exports, to above pre-pandemic levels, and imports pretty much at pre-pandemic levels. We're running a small trade surplus, which is a good thing. I'm not sure that that's going to last very long. All right, that was a hand. Oh, I beg your pardon, we're not quite done. A note on unemployment. The point I want to make here is that, look, we know that we lost a lot of jobs. We know that certainly formal employment has recovered since that calamitous fall in employment. The point I'm making here is that our two major surveys, the quarterly labor force survey and the quarterly employment survey, give slightly different readings of unemployment. We should take current unemployment numbers with a little bit of caution, especially since Stats SA changed its methodology in the QLFS to telephonic interviews. And there is a concern, I guess, that the survey is currently not as representative to be. And the point here is, I believe as a trade unionist, as anyone within the movement, we should take every opportunity we can find to make sure that Stats SA has the budget it needs to run proper surveys. Its budget was cut by about 25% in 2022. This does not bode well. And anybody who says that we don't have the money needs to understand that the cost of Stats SA properly is triple the benefits of a good quarterly labor force survey. It helps us, you know, as trade unions, as policymakers, as any kind of social actor, take every opportunity you can to lobby for Stats SA to be funded properly. Right, that was then a handful of economic indicators. And now we consider a handful of bargaining indicators. There is set the trend between 2017 and 2021, with the exception of agriculture, which has remained relatively flat. We see settlement levels falling over the last period quite significantly in bargaining terms across all sectors. So clearly we can see, I think, the effect of things. One is the pandemic itself, And the second is that inflation, up until recently, has been falling, has been relatively low. And inflation is, of course, quite central to bargaining. A quick snapshot of 2022. Look, this is a small sample, so you should take it with a grain of salt. On this vertical axis, we're tracking the settlement levels, and on the horizontal axis at the bottom, these are the kind of wage levels, and we have a median settlement level in 22 of 6.5%. It does range between 3 and almost 10%, but the settlement level in the middle of all those settlements is 6.5% so far, from what we can tell. A quick note on inflation. Any negotiator needs to have an opinion of what is happening with inflation. This tells you a little bit about the trend over the last 5 years or so. What we see is inflation falling consistently from 2017 to a low average of 3.3% in 2020. It has since started climbing. A rough estimate of average inflation this year so far is about 5.8%, although the last release was, I think, at 5.9, so that average looks, to my mind, to be set to climb. If you look at South Africa and you look at the globe, it looks to me like there are a lot of inflationary pressures, and so there's every, I think, likelihood that inflation will breach that 6% threshold that South Africa has been pursuing for many years now. I don't think that's terribly contentious. I've outlined that first point there. I would say that a lot of the pain, especially in the form of job losses, should be behind us now. And industries and sectors are recovering off low bases. And in many instances, they have shed a significant amount of labor. One would hope then that, that pressure should be released from the negotiating table to some degree, although in a very tragic way. I do think employer sentiment is very weak. Expectations are set low, and the public sector appears to be role modeling settlements below 5%, about 5%. So there's further downward pressure for negotiators. All right, that then was a run through to get a sense of what's happening out there. And we looked at a few indicators. What we're going to do now is we're going to invite in 3 voices, provide updates from actual bargaining experiences out in the world. We have Susan Plateng from Haspersa talking about public sector negotiations, Cynthia Joyce of FAWU talking about what's happening at Clover in the dairy sector, food manufacturing and dairy sector, and then also Clement Marule of Nehawu also telling us a little bit about their experience of negotiations in the Public Service Bargaining Council.
I'm now going to give a background of our negotiations in the public sector. First, I'm going to start with the lessons. The first number one lesson that we have learned as unions in the public sector bargaining council is that we need to ensure that we've got a written confirmation from the minister to say that there is budget for the resolution that we'll sign. This lesson we have learned from the Constitutional Court case, where in 2018 we signed a resolution with the employer for 3 years. The employer reneged on that resolution, ran to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court found that there was no written confirmation from the minister. Now, from now on, before we sign any resolution, we'll ensure that we have that confirmation. The second one, we also want to ensure that we put our demands in with the employer for wage negotiations before the budgeting processes of the employer. Because what has happened is that the employer goes on and come up with a budget. When we come to negotiations, we've got a ready-made cake. We have to start cutting that cake in terms of our demands. Now for the next financial year, 2022, 23, 24, we are going to start with our demands in August, so that when the employer starts with their budgeting process, they've already got our demands. This year we've been beaten by time. The employer has told us that they only got 20.5 billion rent for public servants. That is a ready-made cake. We need to negotiate on that. And when we went to negotiations, that employer gave us a 4.5% salary increase, worked out of that 20.5 billion. And we were very sorry about the situation, because we are not going to accept it. We're not going to accept a situation where our members get a salary rise that is below the CPI. Our CPI at present, as we speak, is 5.9%. So if we accept the 4.5%, it means our members will be short-changed. The third issue that we have learned as trade unions in the public service is preparation, especially on the economic outcome. The employer comes to negotiations already with the economic outcome, telling us about their debts, that they need to service their debts, that there's no money, all the money is gone, but they don't talk about the SOEs and the corruption. So as trade unions and as federations in public service, this time we're very clever, we're very forward. We came up with our economists, and they gave us an advice on the issue of the economic outlook that assisted us to punch holes in the employer economic situation. Now the employer is not going to run away with anything. We've got all the facts. The fourth issue that we have learned is that we're no longer going to go for a multi-term. 2018, 2021, we had a multi-term where the employer actually begged us to come up with a multi-term so that they can be able to prepare for the coming negotiating cycles. What happened? The employer just says they don't have money. Now we want a single term, and they must commit to that. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the update. I think I've already touched it. The 4.5% the employer has put on the table, we have rejected it. We said the employer must go back and see that they increase the 24.5 billion rents that they've budgeted for the public service. There is no way that we are going to agree that the SOEs, CEOs are getting millions, and while they're also getting their money from the same pace of government, and public service is being so short-charged.
At Clover Workers, we went out on strike. We had signed a 1-year agreement during the strike, but the company had proposed initially for a 3-year wage agreement. But we then said, no, let us take a 1 year because we don't want to engage anymore in the multi-year agreement. But from ourselves, we are 5 unions within the Clover strike, but all unions felt strongly that their demand still maintained of 7% wage increase because they believe last year they have signed a 6.5. So their mandate was not to go below them. Now from us as labor, we then decided, let us engage the company. So FAO then decided to go on its own to sign for a wage agreement of 1 year because we wanted to put aside to merge the 2 issues of having Section 189 with the retrenchment of 1,400 people. We then said we cannot demand for a higher increase at the expense of losing workers to remain unemployed on that part. Well, on the company side, we believe strongly we signed a 1-year deal, although the other unions did not want to take that 1-year deal. And currently at this point in time, that 1-year deal with FAO that they've signed is what we will have enforced to the company, because the company did not want to implement that wage increase until other unions come to the party. But we then, as a trade union, had applied for the enforcement for that wage agreement, which we believe this is what we have. The company had also said now, recently, where we are, a proposal of a 3-year deal of 4.5. 3% in the second year and 2% the following year. We had then written an email to say we will meet. We cannot engage over the email. We'll have to engage each other and find a solution, but we will not engage each other on multiple agreements on that one. The challenge that we have faced was that in terms of the Section 189, we were not ready in terms of all as labor to engage on alternative to austerity measures that was presented to us. Which one was the most serious one was the issue that we rejected is around the salary wage cuts, where the company has done a research and say to us, look, your workers are earning too much money in the merchandising sector. So we believe aligning them with what's happening out in the market. This is what we are presenting, a wage cut over 2 years, 30% in the first year and 60% in the second year. 30% in the second year, which will conclude to 60%, which became a serious issue for ourselves. But currently where we stand at FAO, because we never issue a notice of strike, workers have joined the strike in solidarity at that time. So the method at this point in time, we have served notice for labor court as FAO, and because the other unions have issued a notice for strike, and us, we also joined the strike. But with advantage labor at this point in time, that FAO was able to take the matter to court, and we're waiting for a date as we are standing. We also apply for enforcement of the 1-year agreement that we have signed, because we believe as trade union, we from ourselves, we're supposed to have met together and started preparing. But unfortunately, because it's 5 unions from our listen, in the beginning, we did not go together prepared as unions when we were engaging employers. So that's a mistake that we've made and the lesson that we have thrown. So understanding that everybody is fighting for survival in terms of membership. But the key issue, the solidarity amongst trade union and workers is very much important. So when you go there to present of that nature, we should be well prepared around in terms of finances of the company, in terms of engagement of austerity measures. I know with the throwing lessons that we had in terms of how we engage effectively on retrenchment is something a lot of trade unions are not very much want to engage on losing the members, but we don't have alternative to the proposal that are being made by the company where we say, look, alternative, instead of this, let's take a reduce of hours and build up in terms of productivity and find a way where workers don't lose their job, they don't lose their finances, even if it's a wage cut, how do we merge on that one? So from our experience as labor, we need in future to work together, solidarity, and empower ourselves in terms of the financial indicators when a company like this nature, especially with Clover, is a company that has been merged on with Milko from overseas, where they believe the takeover, they will not retrench anybody, and they are there to make more employment within Africa. But that issue was not there up until today. So the deadline in terms of them not to retrench any worker, moratorium that put in place was at the end of October 2023. But despite the overrule of that, we are sitting with government. We have to say, can you explain to us, this company is not the only national company international came to South Africa. We had Walmart, all our companies that come international to the country. They keep undertaking no retrenchment, and you guys are here to monitor as as official. What is your role when it's a breakthrough where they continue without the 3-year cycle, they still continue to retrench workers at the pace of operational requirement or financially? So I think in that way, that was quite a huge experience from ourselves. It's something that we're not expecting, but I think drawing from lesson, we need to arm ourselves in terms of the acquisition. All this acquisition in the past, what has happened was the government is saying, despite this flow, we can't reverse the situation. Now, there has to be accountability of that nature. I think going forward, we need to seriously look at companies that come into the country, trade unions, with an expansion into South Africa, into Africa, but what impact that is there for workers. I haven't seen any company that came in Trenton into the country where they say they're here to make better job for workers. This is where we are. In terms of our 5 years, this is our plan. I think as unions, we need to also play a huge role in monitoring when these acquisitions are signed or recorded, so we document and hold them accountable on that basis. But currently where we are preparing for another wage negotiation for next month. The issue of the workers, the 763 workers, where the company reduced their salary, the matter will be heard at Labour Court. We're just waiting for a date on that one, where we believe the company was wrong to impose a wage reduction on those workers. So we advise all workers in February to go back to work and let the court decide in terms of the company whether they are right to continue to with the reduction of wages. So from us, if we have to win this case, it will set a presidency for all other unions to say, people cannot just walk in and decide overnight that your salary needs to be cut because they believe you are earning too much in terms of the market out there. We want people to earn enough where they can afford to sustain themselves in terms of the current situation. I thank you.
Public service or government is the biggest employer, almost of 1.2 million public servants in the country, public servants in the country. So, as the biggest employer in the country, there are those particular challenges, or that comes with that particular bigness. Firstly, is that being the biggest employer, it is also a trendsetter in that almost all the other, bargaining council or sectors of our economy are taking cue from what the public service does in its bargaining setups. So for the past 3 or 4 years, we have seen public service or public service in particular, setting very difficult trends in the entire, the economy or the sectors of our economy. Firstly, starting with the issue of reneging from a collective agreement. That reneging from a collective agreement, the PSCPC Resolution 1 of 2018, has muddied really the playing field in almost most of our sectors. Most of the employers now are finding very easy to, to renege from multi-year agreements. We're talking from entities like SARS has reneged from a multi-year agreement, and other public entities that have done so and agencies that have done so. So it is another trend that we're saying that the government continue to set very problematic trends in the entire, economy of our country. The next lesson that we have just learned, it is the introduction of what the government calls a cash gratuity, as opposed to an increase on the baseline. So we have seen in 2021 government offering government employees a cash allowance called the cash gratuity, as opposed to giving them an increase on the baseline. That on its own means, therefore, that government employees, when they leave government or go to pension, they'll pension very poor, because for the past 2 or 3 years or so, they have not been receiving significant increase towards their pension. So that on its own, it's a very difficult phenomenon, as we are now seeing most of the employers, even outside public service, they are also introducing giving some lump sum, once-off, cash gratuity, as others calling it an allowance and so on, and shying away from giving employees an increase which will also grow their pension. So that is also one of the newest phenomenon that has been introduced by government, which is muddying also other sectors outside the public service. The other lesson that we have we are now pushing towards, it is the enforcement of collective agreement. So currently we have not been having a tool to enforce our collective agreements that we sign from time to time. So the next area really, it is on the implementation of the austerity measures. We have seen for the past 3 or 4 years, government has been introducing or implementing austerity measures. Austerity measures, meaning therefore that they are cutting on the vacant posts, they are cutting the budgets of various departments, they are cutting the budgets on the compensation of government employees and so on. So we have been fighting that, and it is a fight that needs to be fought from now onward. So these particular austerity measures, I've heard Comrade Cynthia also speaking about those austerity measures. They are on, regardless of the National Treasury, who are continuously refusing and denying that they are implementing austerity measures. But we are feeling those particular austerity measures as public servants currently. And our bargaining council is one the component that is really suffering from those the implementation of austerity measures. The next one, it is during the COVID-19 disaster, government failed to protect and motivate frontline workers, regardless of frontline workers being out there trying to protect the nation against this particular pandemic. Government failed to give them at least an allowance or protection. Instead, they kept on stealing the PPEs. So it is one thing that we, as public servants, we are really angered, to say the least, for government failing to protect and defend and motivate these particular government employees, because they really fought against COVID-19 without even having a salary because of the reneging from a collective agreement by government. So the last one, we just emerged from a public service summit this year. So we do have a declaration. We have an implementation plan that we have just developed. We are working very hard to make sure that that particular public service summit is not one of the talk shows. That's why we have developed what we call an implementation plan to make sure that every little resolve in that particular declaration is implemented. Thank you very much.
A big thank you to Susan, Joyce, and Clement for sharing your experiences with us. We move back in to our presentation. This guide is for working class leaders, for the shop steward, the organizer, the negotiator, who organize and represent workers in a world of work that has changed profoundly over time and which continues to change. The first chapter focuses on negotiations as a process, and it breaks down the bargaining process into 4 main parts: preparation, negotiation, the agreement phase, and the implementation phase. And it offers a series of guiding steps that a negotiator can follow in each part of that process, so that you have a structured approach to it, and that you see the next phase coming, and that it helps one think about what are the key things to be thinking about in each of those phases. That's introduction to negotiations. The second chapter is what we're calling a think piece, shorter piece around organizing and recruiting. And it invites you to think about these 2 very important processes. 2 ideas I'd like to share from this is, one is the link between bargaining and organizing. And I think it's fair to say that organizing has little meaning if it does not find expression in bargaining. And likewise, bargaining will have limited influence if it does not consolidate and expand opportunities for organizing. So the idea is that we're thinking about these things as mutually reinforcing processes and do not think about them in isolation. Another way we invite you to look at it is we distinguish between a worker that has been recruited on the one hand and a worker that has been organized on the other hand. And we describe what each of these, in a sense, different kinds of workers, the worker that has only been recruited and the worker who has been organized, we look at what they might be thinking about, what they might be feeling, and how they might act. And I'm just giving you a little screenshot from that chapter, and I'll just point to one or two examples. So you see, we look at the head level, the heart level, and the feet level, which is thinking, feeling, and doing. And so, you know, at the thinking level, a worker that has been recruited should understand the story of the union and the rights the union has won in her workplace. On the other hand, a worker who has been truly organized beyond that will know her rights and the responsibilities of the employer. One more example, at a heart level or a feeling level, a worker who has only been recruited might have shared her fears, needs, and aspirations with the union, while a worker that has been organized will feel a real sense of belonging to that group, to that collective. So I think we believe it's a useful way of thinking about two very important processes in a way that's a little bit less intellectual, a little bit more lived, felt, that I think all of us can understand quite easily, but helps us distinguish very important dynamics that we should be thinking about. Chapter 3 is around solidarity. And at this point, let me just throw something in here that I should have at the beginning. You know, listening to the comrades who shared those updates from the public sector and from Clover, there were a couple of key issues that came out of their insights, I thought. They ranged from things about, you know, good faith bargaining. Does your partner have the authority to say yes? They talked about the timing of negotiations and some of the dependencies that result from timing. They talked about preparation and expertise for bargaining. They talked about multi-term agreements. They talked about multinational corporations. They talked about a strategy of offering cash gratuities in wage bargaining. They talked about employers coming with their own benchmarks for wages and using these to fragment workers. And then one of the last insights was the need for solidarity and networking and a united labor front. And that leads us into this chapter, a think piece on solidarity. But a number of these insights are addressed in one way or another in this guide, I'm very happy to say. And so I think the guide really can give you a sense of how to deal with, how to think about what can be some quite difficult topics. Back to chapter 3 on solidarity. This is about building alliances that can further collective bargaining, and it describes 8 leading ideas for building solidarity in and through coalition building. And the one I think really important idea, and it might be the wisest thing you hear today, is this idea of sharing power and decision-making when building alliances. And the point is made that for unions, many of you here, sitting around a table is more likely to be associated with bargaining. It's a give and take, and there's a focus on who holds power. Whereas solidarity is about shared power. It's not about taking all the power for yourself. And this is a very important starting point for solidarity and coalition building. That's chapter 3 on solidarity and coalitions. Moving through to chapter 4, using the law to support bargaining strategies. This is a great chapter. I think it walks the negotiator through 16 quite common workplace challenges that most worker leaders will come across at one point or another. And it points to the labor laws that can help deal with these situations. Chapter 5 focuses on negotiating conditions at work. And what it does is it brings a framework for a negotiator to give them a structured way of thinking about conditions at work, to help not just be drowned in a sea of conditions and what to focus on, what's important and what's not. And it helps bring this framework by helping you think about what is in a collective agreement, what should be in a collective agreement, what can you still negotiate beyond that. It talks about the main types of conditions at work. and it reminds us of the value or the underlying principles of each of these conditions. So as an example, annual leave, for instance. Annual leave is not just a number of days per year. The underlying principles of an opportunity for workers to rest and rejuvenate, to participate in social, cultural, community activities and rituals. These are very important underlying principles that we shouldn't lose sight of. And then it also gives examples of these main types of conditions at work and provides some benchmarks in the law and also some benchmarks from other collective agreements that we can all learn from as we set about trying to negotiate conditions at work. Moving along to chapter 6, this dives into wage bargaining as a particular subset of negotiations. It provides you with a set of steps for building a wage demand. It's different approaches to dealing with inflation. And it gives you some simple formulas which you can use to calculate percentages and money amounts so that you can communicate these effectively to workers. And as a result, manage their understanding and expectations better. In chapter 7, the theme here is bargaining for gender equity. One leading idea here is that the struggle for gender equity is not only about treating men and women equally, but it sometimes means treating the genders differently when it is appropriate. And this chapter explains important terms to know. It describes specific bargaining demands for gender equity, and it provides the negotiator with a guide to the bargaining process. I would hope, that the idea that a union simply has to be, put it this way, a union that is not tackling the question of gender and within that not championing women's rights and interests is not a union with great growth prospects. Chapter 8 is around inclusivity, rights, inclusivity, and discrimination. And it explains how, as negotiators, we can help protect workers from oppression and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender. And again, in this field, it explains important words and terms that we can use when talking about equality. And it also gives an overview of legislation that is intended to protect workers from discrimination. And for those of you for whom this is less familiar territory, this chapter is a great introduction into the field, understanding the terms, the vocabulary, and giving you some guidance on how to think through these questions. Okay, chapter 9, negotiating retrenchment. Now, unfortunately, this has been all too commonplace in recent years. But this chapter was co-authored with, it wasn't really co-authored, it was in fact authored by the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union. You have had a lot of experience since '94 in the domain of retrenchment, and it helps negotiators think through a plan to save jobs at companies. That is basically it. And it describes not only reacting to a Section 189, but it describes an early warning system for detecting that a company is in distress. It provides help with understanding, what is wrong with the business and deciding on what the most important interventions might be. And it also describes strategies for minimizing the impact of retrenchments when they're unavoidable. I think this is an incredibly useful chapter. It should be of interest to a great many of you. And I think the one last point to make there is retrenchments are by nature, it's hard. It's a hard process to manage. It's a hard process to be involved in. And I think that just makes this chapter all the more important. Our second last chapter is on trade unions negotiating in value chains. And I think this, for me, is a really important analytical tool for the trade union movement. It introduces you to the concept of value chains, and it explains how almost all negotiations take place within part of a larger value chain. So the world is often bigger. You might be negotiating somewhere in Johannesburg, but often you are part of a much bigger picture. And it may be that power is unevenly distributed in that chain, and power is no longer situated where it used to be. And this is very important to know as a negotiator. So this chapter describes how a union can use value chain mapping to make connections between workers that processes of informalization have often hidden from view. So at a very simple level, you know, all those workers in security, contract cleaning, catering, these are the most obvious examples. 15, 20 years ago, they were all employed by the same company. And now, very often they're right in front of us, but we don't see them anymore, because now we're told that in fact they operate in another sector, regardless of the fact that there they are, sitting in the same workplace, doing the same work that they always did. Value chain mapping is a way of re-seeing the workplace. It's a way of, I think, uniting the workplace when business is constantly trying to fragment the workplace and fragment workers. A really important and interesting chapter. Finally, but certainly not any less important, the future of work. And this chapter describes main process features of the future of work, some of the words and terms that are used to talk about it, and it describes strategies that unions can adopt to be more influential in shaping and responding to the future of work. And we're doing really well for time. It's just coming on for 2 o'clock. We have set out, well, we set out to try and stimulate your thinking, to bring you things that you need in a very difficult job where you need to be an expert in many things as you try and negotiate working class interests. And we've tried to bring you some content that helps you do that. We have tried to stimulate your interest in joining us for the series that will follow through the course of this year, where we dive into each of these chapters. We hope that you will join us. There's currently a poll. If you look at your controls, you will see a poll there that invites you to select your top topics, the 3 topics that are to you the most important or the most interesting, the ones that interest you the most. And if you can select 3 from the list, there are 11 in the list, so you might have to scroll in that box. Select the 3 that are your top 3 choices, and then we will react to that as the LRS. And I would think that we might prioritize the 3 that get the most votes and move to those in our forthcoming webinars. We'll let that poll run just for a minute or so, and then I would like to run one more poll where we're going to ask you what time of the day you think is a good time for this kind of webinar. The time slot we're talking about is 1 to 1.5 hours maximum. Probably aim for maybe 1 hour. I think that's a very manageable slot. So at some point we'll close this poll in the next minute or so, and then we'll run one more poll. We would appreciate your responses. It helps learn. Thank you for joining us. It's been our pleasure to share this work. Looking forward to the coming webinars.